So today I want to tell you a little bit about how economists think about climate change, what we know, what we don't know, and how we think about public policy. So there is this field called the macroeconomics of climate change. So basically this is the field that tries to think about the aggregate consequences and determinants of climate change. And this is different from many other areas of the economics of climate change that will study more micro issues. So for instance, people will study the effects of climate change on health or the effects of climate change on educational achievements. In the macroeconomics aspect, we think about the big picture. What happens with countries, with their wealth, with their income, etc. It was started by these two lads. The one over there is William Nordhaus, who was the first to try to come up with something that I will describe soon, the integrated assessment models. He got the Nobel Prize out of it, so pretty cool for him. And the other one is Nicholas Stern, who published in 2009, or was the director of something called the Stern Review, which put on the table a lot of the issues related with climate change. Now, this is a large and growing field of research, and obviously in 30 minutes I can only give you a little bit of the basic ideas that is behind it. Also, it's a field that takes climate science as given. Okay? I'm not a climate scientist, obviously, so what I'm going to follow is the mainstream of climate scientists out there. And the economists are going to give it a special twist to it because we are going to highlight the importance of the uncertainties that exist to it and how these uncertainties matter for our policy decisions. But, and this is why this is economics, we are going to think about the responses that economic agents are going to have to a changing environment. We are going to evaluate welfare, and we are going to attempt to design optimal policies. And in the case that optimal policies happen to be impossible to implement because of political reasons, perhaps think about second best policies, which means what type of policy is more or less reasonable, and I have a chance of get them through Congress. Now, a couple of caveats, since we are going to do this, at the Newman Center. First of all, I'm going to report results from what economists call standard welfare analysis. And for those of you with a little bit of philosophical background, it's nothing more than applied utilitarianism. I have expressed in many occasions my unhappiness with applied utilitarianism. And when I'm teaching first-year graduate students, I suggest them that they read Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit, not because of any other reason, but because it highlights some of the contradictions of a standard utilitarianism. In addition to it, there is the rather subtle issue of the discount factor. Climate change is about today versus tomorrow. What type of sacrifices we need to make today in favor of the generations that come after us? And of course, this is also a deep issue in philosophy. And I always quote Groucho Marx, the right Marx, not the other one. Why should I care about posterity? What has posterity ever done for me? Now, finally, a small caveat. Since this is a short talk for the general public, I will omit most references and sources. If you want to know more about where I got the graphs and how they are interpreted and who were the persons behind it, let me point out, I will be glad to provide you with that information. Yes, let me point out that a lot of what is here comes from my co-authors and friends, Simon Scheidegger, Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, and Per Crusel. And indirectly, I guess, from all the co-authors of these three chaps. Okay, so some background. So I told you before that we are going to take climate science as given, and perhaps a good way to get this out of the way is the summary of the climate science that Hassler and his co-authors published just a few months ago. And they basically say there are 5 things that we believe we know. The first is that there is a very simple system of 5 different equations. Don't worry too much about what that means. It's just a system of equations that describe the dynamics of climate on the planet that relate the emissions of CO2 and global warming, and they do it surprisingly well. Okay? Both in quantitative terms and qualitatively. Second point is global CO2 emissions are not falling, but they are increasing at a lower rate than 2 decades ago. And both consumption and produce-based emissions have fallen in the European Union and in the US over the last 2 decades, but the opposite is true for the emissions in China and India. The third thing that we know is that global warming is approximately proportional to the cumulative emissions of CO2 in both the short and the long run. The fourth thing that we know is that there is a lot of a heck of oil and coal on the ground. Okay? So even if we were just going to pump up and burn the oil and the coal that we have on the ground, that is very cheap to do so. Okay? I'm not talking here about going to strange places to pump up that oil. We will be way over the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius global warming targets of Paris Treaty. And the last point I want to highlight is that the problem of climate change is not as much the average temperature, is that you are going to have a lot more tail events, extreme days. So, if we just had 1 degree higher every day of the year, that will not be a big deal. The problem is that in the summer, we are going to have a lot of days that are going to be over 100 Fahrenheit, and that's going to be very, very costly. Okay. So I mentioned before that Wilhelm Nordhaus developed the idea of the integrated assessment models. So what is an integrated assessment model? Basically what you do is you try to think, you write a mathematical model where you try to think about how the economy and the climate interact, and this is going to be quantitative. Okay? This is about having numbers. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with too many numbers today, but this is about numbers. And integrated assessment models have 3 components. We are going to model the economy using the standard tools that we use in macroeconomics. That economy, because of economic activity, is going to generate CO2, which is going to have an effect on climate. And climate and the changes in climate are going to have some damages, and we are going to specify something called a damage function. It's very hot, so people die, or it's very hot, so it's difficult to do economic activity, or it's very hot and there is a drought, and we cannot produce enough food, and those damages feed back into the economy. So we are going to have these 3 different sections of the model, and we want to do it in a way that they make sense together. Now, going to try not to scare you, but this is what is known as a nonlinear system. Okay? If you remember Jurassic Park, kind of the cool guy talking about nonlinearities, well, this is as nonlinear gets, and it's also stochastic. What does stochasticity mean? It means that it's random. Okay? So I don't know what the weather will be tomorrow, and I don't know what the weather will be 1 year from today, but I'm going to have a distribution of probabilities that is going to happen. Now, why do we use integrated assessment models? For 3 things. The first thing is for what we call in economics positive analysis. Positive analysis is not that we are, happy and optimistic. It just means that we want to figure it out what is going to happen in the future. So this is just computing future paths of variables of interest, like output, unemployment, inflation, so on and so forth. Then we are going to use these integrated assessment models for something called normative analysis, which is basically the design of optimal policies. What will be the optimal thing to do to achieve as high as welfare as possible? And then we are going to use them for counterfactuals. So what is a counterfactual? Is thinking about the consequences, for instance, of mitigation. Thinking about the consequences of changes in technology. So these integrated assessment models are extremely useful. Interestingly, the IPCC, which is the international committee or commission that studies climate change and makes these rather dramatic statements from time to time, does not have an integrated assessment model. And its economic analysis is in general, I say over there pretty bad, but we are in a small group, awful. Okay. So let me show you an example of a simple integrated assessment models from a good friend of mine, Esteban Rossi Hansberg and Juan Cruz. And what they do is they have a model of the world economy, and they fit in the climate change that science predicts and sees what is going to be the welfare losses. And what they compute is the average welfare loss from climate change is going to be around 6% of total consumption. That's a lot. Okay? To put it in a perspective, economists believe that the cost of business cycle fluctuations is less than 1%. So this is a very, very big cost. It's the cost of more or less 4 years of economic growth. Now, and this is going to be very important for what I'm going to say later. There is going to be large heterogeneity in who wins and who loses. There is in fact places that are going to win out of climate change. Before, Jesse mentioned I studied Minnesota. Happens to be the case that if you're in Minneapolis, a couple of degrees extra makes Minneapolis much more bearable. So if you're in Minnesota, climate change is good for you. But if you're in Miami, climate change is not that good for you. That means that we are going to have welfare losses of up to 20% in some areas of the world. And in that map over there, you are seeing who's going to win and who's going to lose. And the big losers happen to be in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, in general in the south of Asia, and in a big chunk of South America. While most of the winners are going to be in Canada and in the northern regions of Europe. Well, that tells you a couple of interesting things. First, that climate change maybe will not be very important for some people, but will be tremendously important for others. And second, that the way in which these losses accumulate or these welfare losses accumulate, tend to hurt those people with lower income more than those with higher income. That's interesting, and we will come back to that. Okay? Now, there is a lot of stuff that can be done with these integrated assessment models, and a lot of what my own research is about is kind of pushing the frontier of what can be done with these integrated assessment models. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details. Let me, for instance, just point out some of the things I'm working with Simon Scheidegger is we are very interested in improving the science aspect of these models because you need to use something called a climate emulator. Don't worry too much about it. And we are trying to be a little bit more serious about how people think about uncertainty and about tail events. Okay? And that's why there's a lot of economists these days thinking about macroeconomics of climate change. You go to a conference, we all economists migrate in pilgrimage to Cambridge, Massachusetts during the month of July. And there is a big thing over there called the Summer Institute, and you are going to see dozens of papers in this type of things. Okay, so this is the way you publish papers, and you get tenure, and yada, yada, yada. Very good. But you were not here to hear me talking about stochasticity. You were here probably because you are interested in some policy implications. So what are the type of lessons that we get out of these integrated assessment models? Well, the first thing is that there is an agreement of most countries in the world, the 2015 Paris Agreement, that sets up a goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the fact is that the current efforts are far from the goal. And this is particularly serious from China and India. So this is a graph of actually not just CO2, but all greenhouse gases emissions. There is a subtlety over there, but don't worry too much about it. And what you can see is who is emitting and how this has evolved since 1970. At the bottom, you have the Europeans, like my brothers when they drive. And what you see over there is that Europe now is emitting much fewer greenhouse gases than in 1970. And that it turns out to be the case that Europe is not that much anymore. And then you have the United States, who is also emitting less than in the past. But who are the big players in this game right now? Basically China and India. And China and India are growing. And unless China and India dramatically reduce their emissions, anything that we are going to be able to do in the United States or in Europe is not going to move the needle. Okay? Because look at this. This is what we need to do in terms of reduction of emissions. Even if the United States, other Europe, and European Union go to zero, just what China is emitting is more than enough to continue warming the Earth. We can also look at how countries are tackling the challenge implied by the Paris Agreement. And what you have over there is, given the policies announced as of today, well, when this table was done a few months ago, this graph was done, how much reduction of emissions we will have. At the bottom, you see the United States. The United States in 2030 will emit 50% less greenhouse gases. So this thing over there, this orange thing, will be half of it. But if you look at Germany, they are doing pretty good. The United Kingdom, they are pretty serious about that. But look at China. Okay? So at the end of the day, the British, I know that Christina is a big Anglophile, but I'm sorry, Britain is not that important anymore. So even if Britain goes to zero, we are not changing anything. So that's the first thing that we need to understand. There needs to be a lot of action, and a lot of action needs to come over here. Okay. So let's get into a little bit more of an explanation of the challenges. The first challenge is that to go from here to here, that's going to cost quite a bit of money. And there is no other way around it. Some of you may watch The Simpsons. There is an episode, this is the comic guy from The Simpsons, if anyone remembers, and he talks about the worst episode ever. It's kind of a joke of all these trolls on the internet, telling you that you did the worst thing ever. Well, so I always use that the worst economic argument ever is the decarbonization of the economy will create many green jobs. It will create a lot of green investments. Awful argument. Okay? It's not even awful. I mean, calling it awful is an insult to all awful arguments. Every job, quote unquote, created or investment required is a cost for society. It's not a benefit. Jobs are not there in a scarce supply. There are jobs for everyone in the planet. The best way to think about it is the following. Imagine that, a miracle comes now, and we have two technologies. Technology number one. This technology is a net zero technology that will generate all the energy on Earth at the investment cost of $1, and we only need one person to operate it. In technology two, the same thing, but we need an investment of $1 trillion, and we will require 10 million workers to operate it. Which one will you pick? Obviously, you will pick the first one because you can send the other 9,999,000 people at home. Worst case scenario, you put them, I don't know, to paint the Newman Center. Okay? So every time you hear someone saying, oh, the transition to net zero is so great because it will create a lot of green jobs, that person doesn't know what he's talking about. In general, no, I'm sorry, decarbonization will not increase economic growth. That doesn't imply you don't need to do it. But saying that decarbonization will create green jobs is like saying to someone who has cancer and is about to go through chemo, be happy about how much you are going to save on cutting your hair. The second challenge is the large redistributional effect that I just told you before. There needs to be a lot of reallocation of production across space and sectors. And there is going to be winners and losers. This graph makes the point very nicely. Imagine that we tax carbon at $25 per ton, and we take all that carbon tax, we put it on a pile, and we distribute it across all humans on the planet on a per capita basis. That will basically mean that China will need to pay on net around $144 billion a year and transfer 127 billion of those to Africa. That's not going to happen. I don't know how many people you know in the Communist Party of China, but I can assure you they are not going to do that. Okay? The United States will also be a loser. The European Union will lose a little bit less. Europeans are the way we are, so we may even do that. But the matter is that this is going to be very costly for some countries like China. There is going to be large free riders problems. So what is a free rider problem? Is imagine I'm Costa Rica. I'm so small. I emit close to zero in the big scheme of things. I may as well say, let the Chinese and the Indians, or the Americans and the Europeans figure this out. I'm not going to do anything. because whatever I do will not really affect the planet. Well, the problem is everyone is going to think like that and nothing will happen at the end. There is an issue of border adjustments. If you say I'm not going to produce stuff that emits a lot of CO2, but I'm going to import it, well, at the end of the day, we are back in square one. There is very limited fiscal space. There is a lot of investment, public investment that is necessary, and especially after COVID-19, most governments do not have a lot of fiscal space. There is geopolitical fragmentation. So, I have a nice paper where we try to compute the level of geopolitical fragmentation in the world, and you can say that we are at historical levels, and I guess that after what happened over the weekend, this probably has ticked up even more. And we live in a time of higher interest rates. The problem, I was telling you before, is that we are paying something today to get a benefit tomorrow. Well, the interest rate is just the price of today versus tomorrow. High interest rates means that the benefits we will get in the future are going to be discounted at a higher rate. Okay. So that's the pessimistic part of the argument. Now I'm going to tell you the positive side of the argument. And the positive side of the argument is that human ingenuity plus the power of incentives is incredibly powerful, way more than you can imagine. And technology has progressed faster than anyone expected even 5 years ago. So at a very fundamental level, the pure engineering problem of transitioning to a net zero economy has been fixed. Okay? I'm sorry for the physicists, we don't really need you anymore. We already know how to do it. Okay? Let me give you an example. We still need you to invent new things, but given the things that we have already. There is something called the levelized cost of energy, which is a way to think about how much it costs to produce electricity or any other equivalent energy in a way that takes account of the whole cost of a utility plant, from the moment you start digging until the moment you decommission it. Okay. So, if you are going to build a state-of-the-art utility range solar, by utility range I don't mean putting a couple of solar panels on your roof, I mean like a big utility range solar farm, and you are going to do it in a place with good weather like Arizona or Texas, it costs you today around $24 to produce a megawatt hour. There is no cheaper way to produce electricity right now on the planet. Moreover, at the speed that this is going, this levelized cost of energy has been evolving. This is the graphs with some of the actual computation. There is a very good chance that in 2030 the price will be below 10 megawatts hour. And why is there such an important threshold? Because when the cost of electricity is below 10 megawatt hour, it's actually cheaper to build synthetic gasoline than to pump it from the ground. And the good thing about synthetic gasoline is that A, it does not pollute, because what pollutes from fuel are the impurities of oil, not the oil burning itself. And second, because it's net zero. You capture carbon and hydrogen from the atmosphere, you use electricity to generate syngas, and then when it burns, you put it back. So for instance, it will mean that by 2030, we can operate our airline or our commercial jets without any problem at a net zero. We only need the levelized cost of energy to be below 10 megawatts an hour. The second thing that is really amazing is that we have already experiencing a lot of network externalities, which basically means once, for instance, there are Tesla superchargers everywhere, it actually makes more sense to have an electric vehicle than to have an internal combustion vehicle. It's much faster. And for instance, you can see over there some graphs on the adoption of renewable energies that has been much faster than anyone anticipated year after year after year after year. And you see the big spike of electric vehicle car sales all across the world. Okay? So in that sense, from a pure technological perspective, by 2030, a lot of these problems are going to be fixed. Now, the issue is, how do we ensure that the opportunities dominate the challenges? Okay? That we really take advantage of the technology that to a very large extent already exists without being slowed down by the political challenges that I explained before. And what economists have said is, well, this is actually pretty straightforward. Have a tax on carbon and technology agnostic subsidies. So tax on carbon basically says we are not going to play central planner. Okay? The Inflation Reduction Act of Biden and company is plain central planning. It's trying to tell me how should I save on energy. It's not letting market incentives work. A carbon tax says you are going to figure it out any way you want how to save energy. You just need to pay a tax on it. And the really interesting thing is that economists come up with graphs like this where they document that the amount of return you get on carbon pricing in terms of reduction is way higher than any other thing that you can do. This is, for instance, a nice graph from McKinsey, and you can see that there are things like substituting light incandescent bulbs at home for LED is incredibly good idea in terms of the returns you get on the money. There is a lot of other very, very good ideas, but a lot of the things we are doing, like retrofitting gas plants or retrofitting coal plants, are really terrible ideas. Okay, there's just no point in trying to do these things. Okay, let me skip that. And why technological agnostic subsidies? Because we don't really know what technology is going to be the winner in the future. Every time governments say we are going to bet on solar, every time governments say we are going to bet on wind, well, sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. And what we have is, I think, a lot of historical evidence that is much better just to provide the right incentives and let entrepreneurs and private firms figure it out what is the right way to do. And this is, of course, not an idle worry. If we had let nuclear energy develop in the 1970s, we will not be here today. We will have completely eliminated CO2 emissions in the 1970s, early 1980s, and personally, I think that letting nuclear technology pass by, that train to pass by, has one of the largest mistakes humanity has ever made, and on Doomsday Day, everyone who was involved in the production of the movie The China Syndrome will need to pay for the sins for a very, very long time in purgatory. Okay. So what is the problem? The problem is this type of ideas that economists suggest, like a carbon tax, are very difficult to implement. And they're very difficult to implement because you're basically going to start telling people who drive trucks that use a lot of diesel, that generate a lot of CO2, that they need to pay more taxes, and they don't like it. And this is the famous yellow vest rebellion or revolts in France, where people were really very, very unhappy about carbon taxes. And you can try to tell them that you are going to try to compensate them in some way or another. In general, they are not going to believe you. So what economists emphasize is that maybe we need to think about some type of alternative processes, like focusing on different programs and incentives that will reduce emissions, that will mitigate some of the cost of climate change. Maybe we need to start thinking about geoengineering to some level, and also to provide a lot of incentives to research and development. What it is, I think, a little bit sad is that a lot of the stupid things that we have been doing in the US over the last 2 years are extremely costly and don't go very far. This is my Tesla. If, at the end of the reception we can go, I just park it over there. Why did I buy this Tesla? Basically, because the federal government gave me $7,500 tax subsidy. Why in the world someone like me, with my income level, should have a $7,500 subsidy so I can have a Tesla is beyond my understanding. Now, I'm not going to let the money pass, so I bought it. But my car is a testament to the inefficiencies of how the federal government is tackling this issue. And I think there is some irony into it. Now, this is fun. A lot of people are going to tell you about lifestyle changes. Hey, fly less, eat less meat. The European Central Bank now doesn't give meat, doesn't serve meat in the cafeteria on Thursdays. So these things are at best useless. And they are at best useless because their effect on total net global emissions is minuscule. It doesn't even get to the level of a rounding error. Okay? So even if the If all of us in this room go vegan, it's not even the 14th decimal in my computation. In addition to it, they have large negative wealth effects. In Europe, we are shutting down a lot of short-haul flights, which really get a lot of voters very unhappy. And worst of all, I think that the main problem is it gives a lot of people the idea that we are actually doing something real about climate change when we are not doing anything real about climate change. Then there is this thing called the growth. I don't know if you have heard about this, but in the words of Paoli, the famous physicist, these ideas are not even wrong. Nonetheless, there is some evidence that better information, so for instance, making an effort from the government to tell people how to redesign houses to reduce electricity consumption with minimal effects on welfare, have a good rate of return. Educating people that substituting your incandescent bulb for an LED, it actually pays for itself in just a couple of months. Anyway, there is also a lot of people are saying, let's use monetary policy, central banks, financial regulation for climate change. This is extremely costly. It's a very bad idea. It will be the end of the independence of central banks. We definitely don't want to do that. And the same goes for ESG. ESG, most of it is greenwashing. I have a PhD student now showing that what most firms claim is ESG is absolutely worthless. And at worst, is kidnapping shareholders for private political goals. Anyway, let me conclude. There is a lot of challenges about how to tackle climate change. Climate change is a serious problem in terms of welfare, but at the same time, from a pure technical perspective, it has been fixed. Now the issue is how we are going to do this over the next 10 years at a reasonable cost. And no, we don't need to do crazy things. We just need to use our heads and implement decent economic policies. So this is both optimistic, because maybe we can do it, but this is also pessimistic. Look, everyone knows that Argentina has been a screw-up since 1945, and everyone knows the fixes for Argentina. And however, Argentinians have tried their very best not to fix their country since 1945. So let's try to be Denmark and do this right, and not Argentina.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to Jesus. Your talk was extremely thought-provoking, chock full of information, and I think you're doing a real service to the group, the community, and talking about, a very wide range of facts and realities that have to do with the economics and the policy of climate change. So I'm really honored to be able to comment on your work here. So I attempted to be a little clever, and I'm titling my talk sort of The Law and Macroeconomics of Climate Change, another crash course, to put another layer on what Jesus has been talking about. As you heard, my background is in legal academia, so I want to wade into the policy aspects of what Jesus was talking about. So a couple of things that I really took away from the research that Jesus presented. There is an explosion of research on macroeconomics and climate change, and just to give you a little bit of context, it's not just the field of macroeconomics, sort of summertime at the July NBER conference, but it's also in the field of law too. This is an area where lots of really impressive legal scholars want to be wading in and offering a contribution, and the literature tends to be really sort of tilted in the direction of we need to act now, and we need to sort of, channeling the vibe of President Biden's executive order, mobilize a whole of government approach to tackling climate change. And so I want to offer you some food for thought in terms of, that mindset in the law and policy field, and also sort of a lot of what Jesus was trying to do and sort of prompt some of the underlying assumptions about policy interventions surrounding climate change. Because ultimately, I think where our research agendas marry up is when we're talking about the economic implications of climate change and what that means for governments, right, or what that means for the private sector, right? This is ultimately a question about political choices, and it ultimately implicates this really complicated relationship we have between people and the state and private markets. So I want to sort of front end my talk, since I only have a couple of minutes, and give you a couple of really important principles for you to take away from here as you're thinking about, what you think about the landscape of the economic literature on climate change, legal literature on climate change. What is the role of experts here? You heard Jesus mention briefly central banks, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute as a primary case study. But in a democratic society that's bound by the rule of law, do we really think it's the appropriate role of unelected experts, whether they're sitting at central banks, they're sitting at other administrative agencies, to make really tough decisions about what our society should do in place of our elected leaders? And that's a big part of the conversation, big part of the premises that underlie a lot of the legal literature. Second, although climate change, both in terms of economics, as welfare analysis, and in terms of science, is conceptualized and discussed as a global problem, ultimately, because of legal constraints and the reality of societies bound by the rule of law, any solutions that we pursue as a global population have to be grounded in domestic law. And so where does that take us? Third, I just want to reiterate the theme that you heard throughout Jesus's presentation, right? Using law or policy, right? Using a top-down approach to force a transition to a greener economy at a particular pace or in a particular direction, we have to ask, right, whether there are costs or trade-offs or unintended consequences, right? Because that's a particular choice that would supplant letting market forces sort of guide the way. And I think that was an important sort of analogy in talking about the development of nuclear power. Now, ultimately, the reason I put these principles up on the screen is because bearing these three ideas in mind, these three principles in mind, I think is ultimately necessary to, yes, support a society grounded in the rule of law, but also to support really important values around individualism, autonomy, and liberty. Okay, so moving beyond these sort of big picture takeaways, I want to talk for just a second about the case of central banks, right? Because in the universe of policy efforts, aside from sort of the fiscal interventions that we've seen, central banks are the number one most important institution that has really been pulled to the epicenter of this conversation about what governments, what states can do to facilitate a transition to a green economy. So for example, a couple of years ago, you had Christine Lagarde, president of the ECB, saying that climate change is actually mission critical to the European Central Bank. When Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England, he was, out in front saying that climate change is a financial stability risk, and so banks should start divesting from carbon-intensive industries. This was, the implication of that statement. And central banks should start thinking about how regulation and supervision might sort of steer banks toward, green investments and away from brown ones. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has been kicking around ideas for a long time about doing things that involve making it more expensive for banks to lend to carbon-intensive industries and so on and so forth. But it's really important to bear in mind that in as much as central bankers, talk about using very powerful tools at the disposal of central banks to tackle climate change, each jurisdiction is really beholden to a very different set of legal frameworks. So for example, in the United Kingdom, right, the Bank of England has a mandate to pursue price stability as their first responsibility. Now, if they're able to accomplish price stability, then subject to that, the Bank of England is told, have regard to the government's economic policy, and that does include financing a green transition. So there might be an argument, a legal argument, that the Bank of England has some role to think about in climate change, at least as a matter of law and staying within the boundaries of the rule of law. The ECB, one mandate, price stability. However, also buried within the treaties are lots of other references to many, many, many other goals, including sustainability. And so you can see how the ECB, although it tried to politically commit itself to one goal, has found, little pockets of intervening in the climate change debate. The Federal Reserve, right, it has no mandate whatsoever to have regard to government economic policies, no mandate to pursue greening, no mandate to pursue price stability. So the question then becomes, is this a legitimate thing to do? Knowing what we know taking climate science as a given, knowing what we know about the economic landscape, should we, as a society, right, push our institutions to stretch their mandates, the job that Congress gave them to do, right, which implicitly means the job that the people gave these institutions to do more. And so I just want to make two closing points before I finish. I think it's really easy to say, yes, of course, if we want to do something about climate change, why not mobilize a central bank? Big balance sheet, can tell banks what to do and what not to do. Why isn't that a good idea? And again, I go back to those first couple of principles. What are the implications we have when we let unelected central bankers decide the direction of travel in our economy rather than our legislatures? Also really important implications for institutional legitimacy of really core institutions like central banks, and polarization in America and perceptions of elitism. So I referenced this paper that I wrote with Carola Binder, who's a professor at Haverford, and we did a study. So we ran 2 waves of our study, one in May and June of 2021, and then another one in April of 2022, and we surveyed people. And we asked them, who do you think should be responsible for climate change policy? Should it be elected officials? Should it be people at the Fed, the central bank? Or should it be other experts? Now, in the first wave of the study, about 13% of people thought people at the Fed should be responsible for that. Okay, that's a decent response. Okay, so we ran the study again after inflation had risen pretty dramatically in April of 2022. And by that point, only 3% of respondents thought that the Fed should be involved in climate change. So what does this tell you, right? Politicizing really important institutions by having them take up any issue, whether it be climate change, immigration policy, any sort of issue that we really inherently set up our society to have democratically responsive institutions tackle, really puts their legitimacy at risk. Second thing we learned in this survey was that people who were either college educated or got their news from social media, those were the people saying, yes, have the Fed do it. So that implies to us that if we go ahead with this notion that unelected experts forge ahead and do what they think is best for society in lieu of our elected representatives, well, that's just going to increase polarization in America and sort of entrench this perception that we're governed by expert elites. So finally, I want to again return to this point that ultimately, even to deal with a global problem, we have to think about national solutions, and there can't be a one-size-fits-all answer. And we need to think very carefully about what kinds of principles we want to put in place, what kinds of guardrails we want to put in place in terms of the policy measures that we eventually develop, right? And so, just to summarize a couple of these, we really don't want to have expert bodies making decisions about who wins and who loses in society, right? There needs to be an appropriate level of deference to legislatures and democratically responsive institutions. We need to remember that there are important public law values around proportionality, due process, and transparency that don't go away when we put in front of institutions really important and seemingly intractable problems. We need to talk to the public about trade-offs and be honest about what those trade-offs are. And we need to think about the private sector's capacity, right? As tempting as it might be to lawyers and policymakers to think about what the state can do and to think about top-down solutions, for a very, very long time in history, successful transitions and technological innovation has happened in the private sector. And so in some cases, the answer is not always this top-down approach to operationalizing what might seem like a good idea to a lot of academics or smart people, but just thinking about how market forces work and how to best harness those market forces. So that is my crash course on a crash course in law, and I will turn it over now to our next commentator. Thank you.
I want to thank both my colleagues for their crash courses in macroeconomics. I learned so much for you both in the last 45 minutes already. But I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute a few of my own thoughts, linking the talks we have heard this evening to my own very different area of environmental ethics and eco-theology. So just this past fall, some of you might have been aware that Pope Francis shared an apostolic exhortation, Laudate Deum, which he's positioned as a follow-up to his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si', which, if you're not familiar, was one of the first sustained encyclicals on the environment coming out of the Catholic Church. It's the Laudate Deum, what he published in the fall. It's a short document, but one in which, if you read it, you'll probably note there's a greater sense of urgency. More prevalent is Francis's call for effective action on climate change, and a little more palpable is almost a frustration with climate denialism, even within the Catholic Church. I think sometimes as Catholics we might think of this as an evangelical problem, but he's also calling out that denialism from within our own ranks. 8 years on from his encyclical, Francis has had time to process the reception of Laudato Si, and the response, or really the lack thereof, to the message it contained. In Laudate Deum, his righteous indignation at the disproportionate and growing impact of climate change on the poor and vulnerable, which was mentioned by my colleague, is especially evident. And Francis again echoes his earlier disdain, unfortunately, for economists, for financiers, and for experts in technology whom he believes have bought into a myth of infinite progress and unlimited economic growth. So he reiterates the dangers he sees in endorsing what he has been calling the dominant technocratic paradigm. And by a technocratic paradigm, Francis, he's referring to what he thinks of as an erroneous way of thinking that leads us to act as if reality, goodness, and truth automatically flow from technological and economic progress and power. This is a dangerous habit of mind, he notes, that has been exacerbated by recent developments in artificial intelligences, and gets us thinking of ourselves as limitless as a species, even as the resources that we need in order to power our technology, things like silicon, lithium, fossil fuels, are themselves non-renewable resources. So this technology, of course, is not accessible to all of humanity, but instead widens a gap between the rich and the poor, between industrialized and developing countries. As he wrote in 2015, and again he repeats in Laudate Deum, the capacities of technology have given those who have knowledge, and especially the economic resources to use them, an impressive dominance over the whole of humanity and over the entire world. Never has humanity had such power over itself, yet nothing ensures that it will be used wisely, he writes. So as we in ethics are fond of pointing out, science and technology are able to tell us what we can do. Ethics tells us what we should do. I then echo my colleagues in what I take to be a desire to see sort of a more, not just an interdisciplinary approach, but an approach that isn't just relegated to experts talking amongst ourselves, but an approach that brings in more agents in a move to address climate change. So I want to thank Collegium, because rarely do we as academics gather with those outside of our home discipline, or really even write for audiences other than our own immediate peers within the field. When I was sent his article, I said, this is the first time I think I've been asked to respond to an article that contained quadratic equations as a systematic theologian. So that was a treat. In reading through a draft of that upcoming article, I was struck by some of the discussion of the challenges faced by economists trying to represent climate dynamics in economic models. A good economic model, my colleague notes, needs to be informed by state-of-the-art climate science. And this will require economists to align their own models to data from current climate science models, which of course is going to necessitate a good deal of cross-pollination between economists and climate scientists, which, as his sources note, has not always been a top priority. So good economic modeling needs to be accessible, maybe even useful to climate scientists, and climate science also needs to be, of course, intelligible and useful to economists. If our work in the university, if our work as experts is legible only to those within our own field, or very often within our own subfield even, then we miss opportunities to work together to drive the kind of solutions that the problem requires. Responsibility for anthropogenic or human human-centered, human origin climate change, it's difficult to pinpoint. And I think one thing my colleague was highlighting here is it's a crisis that involves a great fragmentation of agency, as we say in ethics. There's leaders of industry, politicians, even religious leaders, as Francis points out, that have all played a role in creating the problem and then must also, alongside scientists and economists and experts, play a role in resolving it. So both of my colleagues called for honesty with the public, and I think that's a really important thing to echo. In marketing decarbonization, the temptation has been, I think, to sell it as a net positive, as you mentioned, that in order for us to buy into something, into various sustainability initiatives, we want to know what's in it for us, particularly economically. We refuse to let go of a popular myth of progress. New technologies, new policies ought to propel us forward, never requiring, of course, any kind of sacrifice or costly change. It's easy to adopt this mentality given the geographically and temporally dispersed effects of climate change. Though we here in the industrialized world disproportionately contribute to its effects, we're not really the ones who right now are feeling the most of its impacts, which can make it very easy for us to want to ignore it. I'm skeptical then that even the most accessible and even the most accurate economic models will be enough on their own, and I don't think either of them is suggesting that it would be, to push us towards effective action on climate change, because I'm really not convinced the problem is just insufficient data. And I think we're probably in agreement, and I look forward to the discussion on that. But climate denialists aside, our key agents, not just experts, but politicians and financiers and religious leaders and the public themselves, seem to be in disagreement not only on what we in ethics would call a non-moral fact, not only on things like the efficiency of different strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the rate at which it's possible to decarbonize, or the economic costs of various policies, but we seem to be in disagreement on important moral facts as well, chiefly whether the wealthy have any obligation to take on self-sacrificial action, economic or otherwise, in defense of the poor and vulnerable, and whether the natural resources of our common home are to be treated as gifts from God or as mere means to increasing humanity's power. Climate change is a crisis that has proven itself to be very susceptible to the temptation of moral corruption. While accurate models of the problem are necessary, I think we also need to be in careful dialogue with our colleagues who study human and institutional responses to this kind of information. What happens when we do give people really great, really accurate models and information, and they don't respond appropriately? How do we move that forward? So it's as St. Paul writes in his letter to the Romans, chapter 7, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. I think sometimes that's sort of what we're dealing with in the climate crisis, is knowing what to do, as you pointed out, having the solution, but not somehow being able to adopt it. So I look forward to the conversation. I'm very much out of my depth with quadratic equations, but I look forward to any moral theological questions. Thank you.